To deny a people the right to self-determination for well on 100 years is to subject them to slavery. To take away the resources of a people and refuse to give them anything in return is to subject them to slavery. To take away the land of a people who depend solely on land for their survival and refuse to pay them compensation is to subject them to genocide.
The Niger Delta is one of the most important ecosystems in the world. I think we're now number 6 or so in the world, the biggest oil. Most of the oil in Nigeria is from the Niger Delta, and Nigeria is the 6th largest oil producer in the world, and I think the 9th or 10th gas producer in the world. So a very important part of the global energy mix and the global economy, and also for the environment. Because of oil pollution and weak government regulation, the Niger Delta account for most of the oil, the gas that is fled around the world, a significant proportion of global warming.
Very hard to get the balance of this. My name's Sakari Douglas Camp, and I was born in the Niger Delta in a little town called Buguma in the Niger Delta, Rivers State. I always thought it was one of the most beautiful places in the world because you could get oysters from the suckers on the mangroves. The roots of the mangroves go into the water, and if you cut off a root, you pluck out a cluster of oysters, and you can roast this on a fire like a kebab and just pluck out the oysters and eat, That's how beautiful and clear the water was when I was a child. And as I grew up, we began to have oil flares all over the place. And I was in England, and I read in the National Geographic magazine that there was a hole in the ozone layer in Australia, and I realised as I read the article that this was because of the flaring in Nigeria, and that really brought it home that the world was actually one, even though people may not have realised it. What happened in Nigeria affected Australia.
The Ogoni people are situated in Nigeria, in Africa, in a state called River State. We occupy a place called the Niger Delta. The issue of the Ogoni people is an issue of neglect, the issue of marginalization, and the issue relating to indigenous people.
When my father started the campaign, and Ken Saro-Wiwa started the campaign, it was really about what was happening to his community. The land that he knew that was a fertile, peaceful community had been impacted by oil negatively. My father was 17 when oil was discovered, and he says he began to write letters to newspapers protesting about the impact. And by the time oil started being pumped out, and there were in the Civil War there were blowouts and oil was spilled into the creeks, into the waters, people began to see the impact of this, the very negative impact of this thing. And after the oil price rise in the mid-70s, then money also now became. So suddenly this place that there were no cars, and suddenly you began to see cars and things, and then you began to see people who were living in compounds like shell compounds. People began to travel, began to see the riches that Nigeria was having. Magnificent bridges were being built, and And so then we began to understand that this was happening because of the oil that was being taken from our community. And by the time people went to Abuja, the center of the government, and then television came and people could see, and people got more information, and we could see that the oil from here is what is created all of these things. They said, well, okay, how come we're not getting these things? And they started asking questions.
We started to fight the multinational company, particularly Shell, and the Nigerian government in 1990. That was when the movement for the survival of the Ogoni people was formed.
And I think by 1990, my father had decided, although he had been raising these questions politically in his work, in his writing, they hadn't really, he hadn't had any impact on the debate in Nigeria. Nigeria's political debate was not really, there were many people other than my father that were advocating for the causes of the Niger Delta and the oil-bearing communities. But it was only when my father decided to add the environmental aspect to it. And then that coincided with, I think, the fall of the Berlin Wall, where suddenly minorities that are trapped in federations became an issue in Eastern Europe. And then the environmental movement started, the Earth Summit in Rio, and then the narratives of indigenous people against globalization. So all of these things all came together in the late 80s and early 90s. My father, because he was a consummate artist, writer, he knew how to engage journalists and tell a good story. He became like a symbol for many people of many things: cultural rights, language rights, human rights, environmental rights. So all these groups adopted the story.
I've lived in England for most of my life. I must say that Nigeria and Britain have always been connected because of colonial past. But I was a child born at the time when Nigeria became independent, and there was just great belief that went through the whole of society, emphasizing that we had something to say in the world. We had something to give to the world as Nigerians. And so when I talk about Nigerian festivals, whether it's masquerades or a Nigerian problem like oil, or the state of Nigerian governance, which has to do with everything, it's part of my life here in London as well as in Nigeria.
When MOSOP was formed, MOSOP had some demands that they made to the Nigerian government and people and the oil companies. That demand, we put it in a structured form, which we call the Ogoni Bill of Rights. We have to fight the oil companies and the Nigerian government for our land, for our farming, and for our fishing. A lot of Ogoni people are not employed by the oil companies. Government do employ them, but that was not enough. We depend on our land. So the environment and our land is extremely, very, very important to us. That is an important part of our life. So we don't joke with the environment. We don't play with it. That is our culture, our tradition. Everything is based on our land. So we don't joke with it. When oil was discovered in the Ogoni in 1958, we thought that they were coming with something good for our people. But we did not realize that rather they were just destroying our environment gradually and gradually. So our people, because of that, are very, very conscious of every single thing that the oil company does. We started the agitation, as I've already mentioned, through MOSOP, and because it was an organized agitation, it became extremely very difficult for the oil companies and the government not to listen to our voice. We used to have individuals coming out to complain about destruction of their land, but the government will just not listen to them. The oil companies wouldn't listen to them. But when we came as a group and started fighting, they now knew that seriously these people meant business.
When my father decided to, as he said it, he'd been a writer for 30 odd years trying to advance the causes of the minorities in the Niger Delta and Ogoni through his writing, and he hadn't really made much impact. And so he decided, in his own words, to take the words to the streets. And so he was part of the group that formed MOSOP, the Movement for the Survival of the Ogoni People, whose mandate was to raise awareness of ourselves as Ogoni people, to raise our psyche, and also to protest against our marginalization within Nigeria, and to protest against the destruction of our environment, and to appeal to the international community to come to help save us. And he began, with meetings with young people, telling them, look, this is who we are, this is where we've been, this is what is happening to us. And I think he energized a lot of young people in Ogoni who had felt, just like me, had grown up marginalized in the society, not proud of our roots, afraid to speak our language. And suddenly, this thing gave us our pride back, gave a lot of people a sense of direction, and gave voice to an anger about the lack of opportunity in the midst of so much wealth.
In 1993, we had the first big protest, which had about 300,000 Ogonis came out to protest against the destruction of the Ogoni environment. And during that protest, no single stone was thrown. It was peaceful, well organized, non-violently, and it was very, very successful.
We are going to demand our rights peacefully, non-violently, and we shall win.
That was when the government of Nigeria and the oil companies knew that these people, because of our organization, that we were serious.
And this alarmed the federal government. And the federal government sent in troops because Shell pulled out, claiming that they were being harassed and they were unable to work. And for that, to the government of Nigeria, when an oil company pulls out, it's a red flag, because once the oil stops, Nigeria does not have money. 70% of our economy, or 90% of our foreign exchange comes from oil. It's changing bit by bit, but mostly, if we don't have oil, the Nigerian government cannot function. So the response of the military government was to send in troops pacify the Ogoni and to ensure that Shell could come back and could continue building the Trans-Niger pipeline and various other, and to secure its assets and so on. And that began a process over the next 18 months of clashes between non-violent protesters. MOSOP was formed on non-violence. My father as a writer, and also he also looked at the numbers. We're very small people. We live on an open floodplain. There's nowhere we can hide. We don't have money. We can't have access. We can't take on the might of the Nigerian army.
1994, there was an incident when 4 of our Ogoni chiefs were killed under suspicious circumstances. We accused the Nigerian government, the Nigerian security forces, of being responsible for the death of those people, even till tomorrow. Because of that, Ogoni was put under military occupation. There were more arrests. The military invaded Ogoni and stayed in Ogoni and arrested all the leaders of MOSOP, all the activists, and Ogoni chiefs were also arrested and detained. During that period, there was a lot of destruction in Ogoni. They destroyed our houses, they destroyed our farms, and so many things were destroyed, and a lot of people were killed. We lost over 2,000 Ogonis during that period.
And then on May 21st, 1994, my father and others were arrested. They were held for another 6 months before they were brought to trial. And during the trial that was described as fraudulent and inconclusive, fraudulent and even went against their own provisions of their own laws. My father and 8 others were found guilty and executed in November 1995. When you look at it, he was held without in detention, without access to his lawyers for 6 months. Even the provisions of the tribunal that were not even obeyed by the military themselves. So clearly an injustice was done. Whether you look at it legally, from a human rights point of view, legally, 9 people were unjustly executed for a crime that no one knows whether actually even happened or not.
I knew of him as a writer, I knew of him as a politician, because after our civil war he helped to build Port Harcourt, which is like, our major city in our state. And Ken Saro-Wiwa was responsible for housing and all sorts of things at the time after the war. So I knew of him from a distance, but when his troubles happened, I was in London, and we all watched with bated breath as his son rushed to a UN conference to try and save his life. We were so surprised and shocked. And when his execution happened, we were lost, really lost, because we just thought we killed a star. How could we kill a star, especially without a proper trial? And I actually did a piece of work around Ken being lost. And at the time I was making sculptures about festivals in Nigeria. And at certain festivals, when a disaster happens with a masked player, a masquerader, they sometimes have to be rescued from the arena, because if they're not rescued, the crowd can actually go in and disgrace them, take their costume off and show them as a man when they've been playing a god. It's a bit complicated, but I did a piece which is called Alagba in Limbo, and it's a sculpture where 4 figures are carrying a masquerader, and the masquerader seems as if he's dead with his arms out like this, and they're actually trying to rescue him from the arena, but he looks dead or lost, because, you know, that's what happened to the Delta when Ken was killed. We lost a hero, sort of thing.
Started in 1983. It was started by a group of students. It was a call from a group of students from the arts and from theatre for other students from politics and campaigning to meet. And there was a feeling that if artists were to collaborate with people from politics background, from campaigning and activism, that not only would the art become more politically effective, but the campaigning could become more imaginative. In terms of starting new campaigns or new projects, it's been quite a long while that we've been working on one topic, i.e. fossil fuels, and how critical it is that the world moves away from consuming fossil fuels. It's critical for reasons of human rights. It's critical for reasons of disproportionate impacts on usually racialized, usually poorer communities where oil is to be found. It's critical for climate change reasons. It's critical for health reasons. It's a finite resource. It's critical to not waste that finite resource on the things that we're using it for at the moment when we have renewable sources. So we started doing that in 1995. And the decision making there was, well, we had been working on water in the late 80s and 90s and looking at London and the way London treats its fresh water and metaphors around water in the city, democracy, water. So we did a project called Homeland, which sort of went between all the work on water and London, and then all the work on London as an oil city. So it was like a point of change.
Well, I must say that working with Platform has been a baptism of fire. The memorial for Ken Saro-Wiwa was a competition, and I didn't know whether to go for it or not. And I spoke to my family and they said, you know, go for it. And why was I reluctant to go for it? I was reluctant because I didn't want to put myself in the firing line, or my family in the firing line, because, you know, oil is an important part of our lives. You know, my brother used to work for Shell as a medical doctor. My my extended family work with Shell, and you know, they're engineers and security guards and all sorts of things. The main employer in Port Harcourt, in past times, was Shell, you know, and to get onto their team was a big deal. It meant that your family was secure. you know, who was I in comparison to Ken Saro-Wiwa? And he got into trouble with his interaction with Shell. So I was reluctant and a little scared to take part in the competition. But I took part in it because, you know, the family said, well, you know, it's art and you're not in Nigeria, you're in England and stuff like that. But, you know, things can happen anywhere. So I took part in the competition, and I wanted to make a sort of campaigning bus and a battle bus, you know, like the politicians have for campaigning to, you know, be it Democrat or Republican or whatever, in driving around the country seemed to be a key sort of element. And then I have a love of, you know, trucks and things anyway, just because trucks in West Africa changed in all sorts of ways to Africanize them, and they look like sort of Mad Max vehicles. They are overloaded with piles of goods, or they have beautiful paintings on them with words that say, you know, God is best, or whatever, God knows best, or God knows.
When I got the commission to be the curator, it was made very clear to me that the project was to be collaborative and collegiate. So not that it would be my ideas, my way of thinking. So it was decided that rather than to choose an artist, that it be open to the public, and that anybody who had an idea would be allowed to send in their ideas about a commission for a memorial. The difference is that they needed to think about the memorial as a modern memorial, and as what we called it a living memorial. By living, we wanted it to be something which was not fixed or statuesque or very Victorian, but something which was much more contemporary, much more conceptual, and much more fluid within a narrative of popular culture. We had a panel, and from our panel we shortlisted the ideas, and the projects we decided to realise was Sakari's project.
My structure is very, very basic. It has Ken's words around it, which is, you know, a shouting thing that shouldn't be forgotten, because, you know, it just says what happened. And then, you know, you having the kind of thing of the other 8 activists that were killed at the same time, I think is a fitting memorial, because they were on his team, you know, they died the same time as him.
I accuse the ethnic majority who run Nigeria of practicing genocide against the Ogoni people. I accuse the oil companies which prospect for oil in Ogoni of encouraging genocide against the Ogoni people. I accuse Shell and Chevron of practicing racism against the Ogoni people, because they do in Ogoni what they do not do in other parts of the world where they prospect for oil.
In my research, I listened to some interviews that Ken Saro-Wiwa did, you know, just before he was killed, and he was so passionate and so articulate about, you know, the plight of the Ogoni people, and just how important it was to recognise the injustice of this kind of exploitation of people that, you know, have absolutely no power, as a sort of corporate body coming into a country and just messing up people's lives without any kind of payback or questions or anything. He really highlighted things, and his words saying, I accuse the oil companies of practicing genocide against the Ogoni, is painful, hurtful, and so correct, because, you know, in the Delta we are scattered. You know, we can't live or work in our place of birth. And why? Because of bad governance, environmental pollution, no work, and you know, Shell has a part in that. And what can I say? It's unforgivable, really.
The reason we went for Sakari's project was for two reasons. One was that the artist herself came from the background from where Ken Saro-Wiwa came from. So we felt that there was an artist who was actually in tune with his homeland and his environment. And more importantly, for me, as a curator, the work that she proposed was the idea of a rendering of a Nigerian bus, which she called Battle Bus, which she felt that would symbolize Ken and also his colleagues. 10 years ago, 2005, we commissioned the bus, we unveiled the bus toured, and the idea of the project and the name of the project was called RSW, Remember Saro-Wiwa. That was because we wanted people to remember Ken Saro-Wiwa and to also remember what he had achieved and remember what work needs to be done in relationship to oil companies and also what was happening in the Ogoni land as well. So this project had to do several things. It had to animate the space it was in, then it had to create an environment and a program of activities in that space to make people understand what the piece was about. So the idea to have a piece of public art in the environment, which is about the environment, sounds strange, but actually was very complicated. So Sakari's piece had to do all of those things. It had to be an art piece, it had to be an art piece which was in an environment which was public, and it had to then contest that environment with the question of environmental racism.
If you go here in the United Kingdom, you don't see any gas being flared. You cannot pollute River Thames. They will jail you straight away. You will just remain in prison for a very long time. But they can go to our place and pollute our rivers and refuse to clean it. That's the difference. They will pollute and refuse to clean it. And that is what we call environmental racism. You do what you cannot do in your country to the people, the communities where you operate. What is that if it's not racism?
You have an atmosphere that has been poisoned by hydrocarbon vapor, carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide. And this flaring of gas has gone on 24 hours a day, morning, noon and night, in sunshine and in rain, for 33 years. Now, the result of that is that you have acid rain all the time. And acid rain, this is an area of very heavy rainfall. Acid rain then gets back into the soil, and what used to be the bread basket of the delta has now become totally infertile. This is the worst case of pollution that I have seen in any part of the world where where people have prospected for oil. For instance, in many other societies, in many other countries, the natural gas is re-injected back into the rocks. But Shell in Ogoni has decided that it is cheaper to poison the Ogoni people than to re-inject the gas into the rocks. So, in Britain, for instance, Shell produces oil. But you look at their adverts, they're talking of keeping the valleys neat and clean so that human beings will not know that anything is going on there. In Ogoni, shell pipelines are there for everyone to see.
So, for example, there was Shell Better Britain campaign in the 90s and in the 2000s. And that there was money inside the Shell Better Britain campaign, charitable money, to be given to fund environmental projects in the UK. So we thought to ourselves, well, hang on, Shell's making profit in Nigeria and not cleaning up with catastrophic results. They make profit. Then they become a good corporate citizen by putting money into education and environmental projects here in Britain to clear up polluted land or to do environmental restoration in Britain. Huh? How does that work? That doesn't work. That's colonial. You know, they're not putting the money in as a good corporate citizen to clean up in Nigeria. They're taking profit and putting it into their charitable wing to clean up generic mess or difficult things or problematic things or to make nice things happen in Britain. So we had this thing of Shell Better Britain, Shell Worse Nigeria. Right.
Under that program, Remember Saro-Wiwa, it took nearly 10 years for the bus to do all those different things, which was a lot, actually. And when it came to the 20th anniversary, it was decided that because we had done that, because we had done Remember Saro-Wiwa, because the bus had toured and because the bus had already animated the different environments it was in, it was important now for the bus to take on another level of action, which meant that it had to go to Nigeria.
So the bus kind of spread out in a way that I didn't design, but I guess, you know, Ken's memory designed it in a sense, because he was an advocate of being able to speak and write and be informed. So I guess in a way all my structure is an emblem, and it's had quite an adventure. The fact that we decided that it could go to Nigeria was mind-blowing, really. You know, I think I approached it as naively as possible, just because an artist can. And my naivety isn't a sort of, it is not a shortcoming, really. It's just looking at the situation from different eyes. You know, take this gift to Nigeria, a gift of information, a gift of our past, and affect the future. Quite simple. Let us try and find a way to clean up the Niger Delta. Quite simple. But it seems to have created quite a storm. Just because I think people are afraid of history. They're afraid of their past. What's the point of being afraid? It's the past. You should be looking forward and trying to change the path.
It couldn't go to Nigeria 10 years ago because it needed to do the work here first. But because of the 10 years and because of all the work it did, it was decided that the next stage had to mean the bus had to go to Nigeria. So then it meant that we had to change the name of the program. it was no longer called Remember Saro-Wiwa, it was called Action Saro-Wiwa, because we wanted to be more action. We wanted people to think that, you know, things hadn't changed and that things still need to be done to raise ideas and consciousness around what was going on in Nigeria, but also what was going on around the planet. And that again, the bus had to be then put in a situation in another environment, i.e. Nigeria, to think about how it can then stimulate that environment and somehow come home to Ken Saro-Wiwa, because the bus was actually making its journey home, which was important. During that phase, it was important that the bus somehow was sent off with some kind of program. And for us, we felt, Jane in particular, it was important that the bus have a legacy and a lasting event in Peckham, and that we work in an environment or in a geographical place in London which had the highest concentration of the Nigerian diaspora, and also a public arena in Peckham platform and in Peckham space to host the bus.
But the idea was to bring together some kind of celebratory, commemorative artwork that commemorated obviously the 20th anniversary of the the Ogoni 9 and Ken Saro-Wiwa. So I was going to create the artwork for the poster, but the other part of this was we actually created a metal sheet, in effect a metal poster, so made out of steel, based on the words that Alfredo used, that were part of a speech that Ken had made. And the idea is that metal sheet would then also hang inside the bus when it goes to its resting place in the Ogoni lands. So in a way, therefore, then the metal again with those words becomes another piece that unites the two artists, if you see what I mean, or the three artists.
And we were very lucky that my friend and colleague Michael Macmillan, working with Peckham Platform, was able to produce an exhibition, an installation, and a number of events around the bus in Peckham Platform to kind of somehow help ease that process to make its way back to Nigeria, and to remind people in London the importance of that journey.
When the bus arrived in Peckham Square, what was amazing was how many young people, local people, a lot of them Nigerian or African, knew of Ken Saro-Wiwa, knew of his story, were affected by him, were inspired by him, felt that he was still, 20 years after he's been executed, a very important beacon for fighting against oppression and freedom, not only in Africa but around the world. And I was really taken aback by this, and so we felt it would be important to leave a memory or create some kind of memory of the bus, even though he had left. And so, working with Peckham Platform, we were thinking, what could we do to celebrate, to mark the arrival of the bus when it arrived in Peckham Square? And so the idea came about of doing some kind of public performance. And I was interested, how could I make these young people connect with this story of Ken Saro-Wiwa and the Ogoni people in Shell that was taking place thousands of miles away? How would you get young people interested? Well, one of the obvious things is that as a result of what Shell is doing, the Ogoni people are experiencing displacement, dispossession, and questions of belonging. Now, the urban phenomena that's taking place in London, not only London, is gentrification, hyper-gentrification. And areas like Peckham are now experiencing this. And that means that, for instance, you're having new developments, so-called affordable housing, but no one local can afford to live there, so they're having to move out. And when we raise this kind of theme with these young people, what I was surprised about is that they could connect with this issue of gentrification. They're aware, even in their young age, of certain places disappearing. And we began to use this as part of the story. So we got 2 episodes of Bassie and Co. And then we had the photographs, which had been taken by Sam Roberts, which we reproduced as wallpaper. We had the filming, which was done by Dub Morphology, who I've been working on a number of projects. And I also produced the script, the performance script, so people could see there's an element of text, how this came about. We had some books from Ken Saro-Wiwa, some of his writing, because people might not know he's a writer, he's not just an activist, he was a writer. We had a second kiosk, which we made out of the pallet wood, which was, we had on a title, Generate Your Own Electricity. And this was providing an activity for young people to begin to understand what is electricity, because our society, advanced, developed society, depends on it so much, but we don't actually know where electricity comes from. It's this invisible thing that comes through the wires, but how is it produced? And one of the things that Ken Saro-Wiwa was concerned about is in the 21st century, coming into how is energy going to be produced?
And last year, 2015, the boss left United Kingdom to Nigeria. When he got to the port in Nigeria, the boss was seized by the Nigerian Customs and Excise. Because the boss had an inscription, I accuse the oil companies of genocide. That's exactly what was there. I accused the oil companies of genocide. So they thought that that was the boss that cannot be allowed into Nigeria, and they seized the boss. There was an international outcry. Activists complained, many people talked about it, social media was everywhere. Yet the boss was not released. Even up till as I speak, the head of customs has been summoned by the National Assembly several times and he refused to appear. That will tell you the high level of impunity in that society. The boss represented the struggle of the Ogoni people and how MOSOP and the Ogoni people have been able to organize themselves peacefully and non-violently to execute a struggle of this magnitude. That is what the boss is about. But yet, we have been denied access to that boss by the Nigerian government. And we know that the oil company's hand is underneath it. That is the story of the boss.
Sitam, sitam, ya Ogoni sitam, ile yira koyon we asiyan ibalo. I said, what going on? What's going on in this world we live in? What's going on? What's going on inside of you and me?
I think November 10th was really a really emotional day, and on the morning of the 10th we were outside the Shell headquarters for a vigil, and I remember being given a text to read out, and I think at that point sort of holding the memory of these people and feeling the gravity of what we were actually honouring kind of struck me, and had that time to reflect on the violence that activists are facing, both 20 years ago and today. We're seeing that now. We're seeing so many violent deaths of environmental activists, but then in the face of that, to come together in community and celebration. So I think it was definitely a powerful day. But then we also had the evening event, which was so joyful and so celebratory, and I think that we would have honoured him and the Ogoni Nine in that way, to have both,
And then we had always planned in the big bid to the Arts Council to do a collaboration with the British Library, because they had programmed a very big West Africa literature exhibition to take place in this period. Now, we had already succeeded in, I don't want to say persuading, but succeeded in advocating that they should include Ken Saro-Wiwa in this huge exhibition about West African literature, because it was the anniversary. And they did include Ken Saro-Wiwa in that exhibition, with 3 items that they obtained from Ken Wiwa Jr. on behalf of the family, which was fantastic to see Ken recognised in that forum and honoured.
Literature has to be combative. It has to achieve. You cannot have art for art's sake. This art must do something, to transform the lives of a community, of a nation. And for that reason, you see, literature has a different purpose altogether in that sort of society, completely different from here. African colonialism is a fact. I believe that it has been assumed that colonialism has been a question of whites against blacks. That is true, but it is also true that blacks have colonized other blacks. In Africa, this was the case even before the white man came. In some cases, some groups were able to colonize others. European colonialism sometimes worsened it. In Nigeria, for instance, the Ogoni people were never colonized by any of their neighbors. The Igbos, the Ibibio, the Ijaw are the neighbors of the Ogoni. They never colonized them. But when the Europeans arrived, when the British arrived, they made it possible for these groups who are numerically superior to colonize the Ogoni. And in fact, in putting the Ogoni alongside the Yoruba and 300 other groups has meant that small groups like the Ogoni have suffered colonialism. And in modern times, because of the Cold War and because Europe used to look away at the incidents of misrule and of oppression, it was quite possible for the bigger ethnic groups to colonize the small ones. What has happened in the oil-bearing areas of Nigeria is very pertinent, because you have a situation there where the resources of a small group have been appropriated by the bigger groups, and remorselessly so, and openly so, and they've even put it into the constitution of the country to give it final legality, so that groups like the Ogoni cannot even argue against that.
In the Delta, we have so many different languages. Ken Saro-Wiwa comes from the Ogoni tribe or nation. I am Kalabari, which is another tribe, as they call it, and our languages are totally different. It would be like English and Chinese. So our common language is English.
So the language of the colonizer, in the case of the British Empire, is English. But a particular kind of English. We're talking about received pronunciation. And so in terms of moving along, the native, the colonized, in terms of them kind of having social mobility, being recognized as being civilized, is to be able to speak the master language in an accurate and authentic way. So there's that, and that's the language that is kind of you find being taught in the schools, because in Nigeria or in the Caribbean, in the British West Indies, the English or British education system is the dominant system as much as the legal system, and the language of communication is English. But throughout history, colonial history, you will find the colonized will take the language of the master and turn it up inside out. And so they create what's kind of Creole. In the case of the Caribbean, this is an English lexicon, English words, but with an African rhythm. And it's called a Creole. Now, historically, these languages were seen as bastardizations of English. Because remember, language is power. And power is language. Through language, you have power. And so to be able to not to speak the Queen's English was seen basically as a deficiency. And so for a long time, Creole, just like Pidgin in Nigeria, is seen as inferior. English is, you're dead from the neck down and you speak like that and you announce. Okay? Creole is with the body, you express it through the body. And sometimes when English white people see black people talking, and it's animated, they think they're going to have a fight, but it's just the language is alive, it's in a living language. Now, a number of writers have not ignored this, from Chinua Achebe, a very well-known Nigerian novelist who wrote Things Fall Apart, and people like Ngugi Wasitobi from Kenya, and Ken Saro-Wiwa have validated the local language, the language of the people, the local colloquial vernacular, and used it in their writing, as well as using English. They're mixing the both.
I mean, if you look at this, my board here, I mean, these are some of my chapters in my new book, but there's a story that I like to tell. There's a chapter I called "If This Is Your Land," ... and it's about the story of an English captain in the 19th century who arrives in what is now Western Canada, and he opens his he calls all the native chiefs to a meeting, and he opens his paper. He's surrounded by his soldiers, and he opens his paper and he says, "By this proclamation, I now pronounce you all subjects of Queen Victoria." And so the chiefs look at him and say, "What is this? What is this white man talking about?" And so they come together and they now send their spokesperson to respond to the captain. And he just simply says, "Well, if this is your land, where are your stories?" And for me, that encapsulates the 21st century dilemma for a lot of communities, is that we have to start telling our own stories. We have to start creating our own truths. We have to start negotiating from a position of, the information, the facts. We've been to various court cases. I've been involved in a court case in New York where we would have lost because we couldn't establish enough facts to convince a jury in New York of the rights of our case, the merits of our case. And what that taught me is that, what my father was doing was that basically he was taking a history that was very much, was to a certain extent oral. We had written history. Our stories are not just written down in a book. Our stories are written down in the distribution of ownership of land, in the ways in which someone inherits a chieftaincy, in the way in which we do our dance, our festivals. These are all parts of our stories. Now, what has made one story apparently superior to another is violence and also the supremacy of the written word. Now, because you have things that are written down, and then that then becomes a contract or a constitution, and then you go to court where you must show the paper, the contract, the constitution. So the written word now becomes the primary agent of storytelling and proving that your story is the truth.
So language is really fundamental, and Ken Saro-Wiwa, in a novel like Sozo Boy, mixes local Nigerian Creole or Pidgin with English and uses it in really kind of interesting way. He uses it in his poetry and definitely in his sitcom series, Bassey and Co. There are elements of the English that's been used, but also the English, that kind of English of the social elite is parodied. What he's doing, in a way, is kind of using English, a kind of heightened received pronunciation English, to parody the middle classes in Nigerian society. So while Bassey and Co. is a sitcom and it's funny, it's also a subversive satire on Nigerian society, in a way. If you look at, the narratives and the plot lines and the characters, they are kind of social types, in a way. And it's all about respectability or gaining reputation. And these are kind of key things in a kind of post-colonial moment, not only in Nigeria, but also in the Caribbean. And it's a question I'm kind of really fascinated by because what it does it relate to? It relates to status, elites, class, the representation of who is more inferior, who is superior. I mean, these may be the legacies of the British Empire, but they have done in their own African diasporic style, in a way. So Ken Saro-Wiwa was very important in kind of bringing that to the fore.
Let me tell you what to do. You want to be a millionaire, behave like a millionaire, act like a millionaire, millions will be yours. You want to be a millionaire, think like a millionaire, act like a millionaire, and the millions will be yours. Mr. B, I'm hungry.
And so what my father started doing was actually writing down these stories. So he had all these Ogoni folk tales, and he realized that he'd heard all these folk tales as a child, but they were not available for his children. So he sent out what I guess you would call I don't know what you would call them, interpreters, to go and record these folk tales on a cassette. And from these cassettes, he now transcribed a book called the Ogoni Folk Tales. And so then he also started writing the history of Ogoni, right? So you can see that he's now taken what was a tradition that was existed, the stories existed. They existed within people, they existed in our dances, in our festivals, they existed in the way we farmed the land, they existed in our language. And these were all stories about who we are and why this place, our relationship to this land, and that we But someone somewhere along the line had come and imposed a different story and said, no, you are now Nigerians. This is the constitution. And in this constitution, Decree number 2 of 1978 vests everything that below 6 feet on your land belongs to the federal government. Now, we'd been living on that land before Nigeria was created, before anybody even thought of the word Nigeria. So all of a sudden you come and tell me without giving me a chance to respond that this belongs to me. So of course I was like, okay, if this is your land, where are your stories? And so what my father did was to tell our story. And that story contradicted the meta-narrative that was being imposed on us. And so what I realized is that story was incomplete. Right? He was killed before he was able to, bring everything in. And so that story is now being told by artists, by musicians. So his story, his death, has become part of that, our larger story. And so musicians, artists, writers, lawyers are beginning to tell another story.
I think one of the key things about the story of doing the work on Ken Saro-Wiwa and the exhibition Doing Nothing Is Not an Option is about the ongoing process of decolonization. This is really vital, particularly in a post-colonial world, because people might think by saying post-colonial that colonialism is over. It isn't. We have a neo-colonial situation. And this is ever present in a globalized world, we think because somehow we've got phones and we can connect on the internet so immediately, that somehow there's a leveling socially. There isn't. The power relations still exist. Race and issues of injustice and inequality still exist. And so the issues coming into the 21st century will be about energy production, how it's sourced, who is excluded and included. Water is going to be a vital resource, as much as access to energy. These are going to be the key questions in the next century. And part of that is empowering local people to be aware of the post-colonial situation they're in, challenging colonialism, and decolonizing our minds.
The wind whispers, return. Head looking backward, the bird flies forward. We turn back to where we came from.
Philosophically and artistically and culturally, I was very interested in the way in which these stories can be used to shape the future. And so I began to conceive of the foundation in terms of, well, let's create a space where you can not only come and learn about Ken Saro-Wiwa, but you can contextualize the entire story of Ken Saro-Wiwa, the Ogoni, Niger Delta, Nigeria. But also, I began to understand, because I'm interested in technology and I'm interested in social innovation, I began to see that the world is evolving in a way, the world we live in is created by natural resources and access to natural resources, shaped by the geography of natural resources. And what I'm beginning to see is that the future will be less dependent on natural resources, less dependent on things like iron, steel, coal, crude oil, gas. These are things which our demand for them is scarring the earth. It's creating chemicals. It's releasing things into the atmosphere. It's creating plastics. It's creating things that are antisocial to the world, and we know it. We can see it. We're beginning to understand that climatic change is as a result of man's impact on the earth, and so people are already beginning to think of how we can live a more sustainable, in better harmony with the world, and technology is offering the possibility that we can do that. So you take the past, what happened, you take the information and the data that's happened, and then you use that to shape an alternative vision of the future that is sustainable, environmentally friendly, can provide the wherewithal for young people to be able to express themselves. because clearly this economy and this system is not doing any of that, or it's not doing it in sufficient quantities to keep people happy, and this has an impact in the way in which we understand, and also because things that we do, what happens in Sokoto has an impact in what's happening in Sao Paulo, right? And it takes people to connect the dots, and something like climate change tells us that is very, very real. It has no borders. It just, what you do here today has an impact thousands of miles away.
And it goes, cambia, todo cambia. Cambia, todo cambia. Cambia, todo cambia. Cambia, todo cambia. Cambia el colonialismo, cambia la explotación, cambia el capitalismo, cambia con todo furor, cambia el clima cuando sufre de los multinacionales. Y para crear esperanza, resistir es esencial. Todos.
For me, as I started to learn about Ken Saro-Wiwa, it was really powerful, because I started to learn more about the roots of environmental justice work. And for me, I was starting to try and connect pop culture, bringing more people in to the movement with this idea of environmental justice. So some of the things that he was doing felt really natural and very reassuring to understand. And so I felt really inspired by getting to know him and reading about the Ngoni Bill of Rights and these relationships between the environment and social justice.
In spite of seeing that, in spite of the trials, in spite of the challenges, in spite of even believing that it's a losing battle, Ken was still brave. He still had that integrity. And for me, that is something that I admire so much, because everyone feels fear. It's not something we shouldn't feel, but it's what we do when we feel that fear that really differentiates us from, are we going to actually fight for humanity and good? Or are we just going to be someone that does nothing and lets evil flourish? Are we going to abstain? So his bravery is really what I find very, very powerful, and I believe has inspired a lot of people.
And so when I was working on the anniversary, we worked on a few pieces to connect the struggle between Shell in Nigeria and the Arctic and the tar sands. And I think that was really it was quite a powerful moment, I think, for the environmental justice movement to see that, the two have become separated very much. We have a very predominantly white middle-class environmental movement that is focused on saving pristine Arctic with the polar bear, versus, seeing the deep systemic roots of colonialism, environmental racism, and land rights. And those two things have become largely alien to each other in the way that the movement operates here. And so I think that's why it was really important to not only honour his memory and amplify the struggle there, but to sort of have these ideas bubble up to the surface again, and to see that we can critique the way NGOs are doing things, and we don't have to be scared that there's no roadmaps to fill that space. We have these roadmaps from people like Ken Saro-Wiwa, and also not to idolise him, because he is, one of the people working in this way and continue to work in that way. So taking that inspiration and then seeing how we can seed that and inspire the sort of difficulty that we're facing here at the moment in the movement in the UK to diversify it a little bit.
I think the bus going to Nigeria is a wonderful thing, and could be to everyone's advantage if we act in a mature fashion and take it as it is. It's a work of art. It is an echo of what Ken Saro-Wiwa said and was, and I'm proud of him. And others should be too. He achieved an awful lot. Africa's first environmental activist and an example to the world, because we all have to be more environmentally conscious. Just because, like I said, what happened in the Niger Delta affected Australia. So we're all in this together, and I think that's the idea behind the bus, and that is why it should still be on Twitter or any kind of news and information, just because it informs us about the environment and the campaign in Nigeria.
It is an international campaign that has saved us from total destruction. This is the way we have been coordinated. This is the way we have been able to do this.
Taking stock of this campaign, this project is huge. I guess I want to say there's a massive responsibility that comes with trying to work to reveal kind of structural violence with affected communities in other parts of the planet, especially when you're sitting in London, one of the world's wealthy cities, where almost everything that we have, including what Platform has come from exploitation, precisely the exploitation that we are criticising. It's really important to Platform that we don't behave in either in a missionary way or in a parachute way. This is about relationships, it's about trust, and we have to keep going. Keeping going can take many forms. Keeping going can be as simple as retweeting, as reposting on Facebook, as checking in with each other and keeping up with the stories and helping get those stories out there. That's a form of keeping going, which is very valuable. Keeping going can be a very noisy, loud campaign that takes a load of resources. If I take stock of what we're doing now, we are showing and expressing and being in solidarity. The bus is still seized. We have to know how to support our Ogoni friends, who it belongs to now. It does not belong to Platform. We have to try and use our time carefully. I think what we've succeeded in doing over all this time is making a very loud noise here in Britain about Shell's involvement in this environmental barbarism. We've made some noises through public art that have been loud. We've shown solidarity with all sorts of other issues around this form of racism. This is environmental racism, an imperial form of environmental racism. We've made explicit relationships between that and other forms of racism that happen in this country.
I think within me there's always this tension between remembering and forgetting. To remember my father is to make sure that he's not forgotten, but to remember it is to bring up a lot of pain and things which will never be resolved within me. But another way of healing is to forget. But if you forget, then there's also something comes up and starts to remind you that, look, this is somebody that died, that did something for you, gave you your chance, and so you must honor the dead. And so that I fought with this, and I still fight with it. Even today, I still have questions about how much time do you spend with the dead, and how much time do you spend with the future. And so what, in a way, I decided that one way to respond to this constant dilemma was to set up the foundation that would do a lot of that work, so that it wasn't a personal thing. Because my father is not just a father to me; he's a father to everybody.
What is of interest to me is that my art should be able to alter the lives of a large number of people, of a whole community, of the entire country. So that my literature has to be entirely different. The stories that I tell must have a different sort of purpose from the artist in the Western world. And it's not now an ego trip. You know, it is serious. It is politics. It is economics. It's everything. You know, and art, in that instance, becomes so meaningful, both to the artist and to the consumers of that art.